friends. This is Niki Siropoulou. Today we have with us Tiffany Vora. Tiffany is Vice Chair of Singularity University in Digital Biology. How are you today?
Pretty good, actually. All things considered, my family is healthy. It's a beautiful day here in California. I get to be with my friends from around the world. So today's turning out to be a pretty good day. How about you?
I'm home. This is my salon. So we decided with the team at Singularity University to invite everybody for a salon event and discuss what is this happening and how we can navigate out of the crisis.
For me as a biologist, a lot of these things I had been trained to think about, but frankly, what I'm finding very interesting right now isn't so much how the virus is behaving, but how people are behaving. And that is something I'm learning a lot about. And actually the survey that I would love for you guys to help me with after today's session is really meant to be me finding out how are people responding to this, so that scientists like me and governments and other regulators can figure out how best to support people.
So welcome again. And as a scientist, can you give us a little bit what is happening, what we are experiencing, and what are the hard data? I mean, from your standpoint, what is really going on?
Well, I've got a lot of things that I want to share with you today. Some of them have to do with the hard data about what's going on in Greece. I also have some hard data for you on the innovations, the therapeutics, the vaccine development. And then after looking at some of those hard data, I want to share with you all some of the thinking I've been doing around what we can expect based on also hard data, but also certain levels of optimism. Because I think at this point, what we're all facing the most is uncertainty. None of us know how long this is going to be going on. So I'm a scientist, so I think about things that are uncertain all the time. So what do I do in order to think about uncertainty? So the two major things that I do are I slow down and I look at data. I look at evidence. I look to find out where that evidence is coming from. I think about whether that evidence is reliable. And then I combine that evidence with my intuition from the work that I've done for many years to try to make my best guess as to what's going on. And then I take my best guesses and I give them to my scientist friends and I say, find everything that's wrong with what I've just done. And then we go, yeah, I mean, that's just how science works. And then we go back and forth until I have a picture of what I think is going on and what I think is going to happen next. And then most importantly, I'm always prepared to know that that picture is wrong and to update it later. So I have a lot of stuff to show you all today that is my current best thinking for where we are and where we're going.
And also you are going to present us a couple of scenarios on how to navigate from uncertainty to safety and certainty, and also some estimate about how long it's going to take and what are the next steps. So if you have anything to show us and share, you can share the screen and you can take over and enjoy your presentation.
So as Niki mentioned, I've put together this whole slide deck for you in a PDF with all of these links lined up and live. So you'll be receiving that from the Greece team after our time together. So there's no need to take screenshots or anything like that. You're going to get everything that I share, plus a little bit extra. So including my information about how to get in touch with me. So one of the things I mentioned when Niki asked me about uncertainty was I mentioned data and I mentioned evidence. And as we all know, the internet is full of information and not all of it is true. Some of it is well-intentioned but wrong, and some of it is just straight up fake news trying to make people react in certain ways. So I wanted to share with you all the places that I go to primarily for my information. So the first thing, absolutely, the first place you should go is to health organizations. So health agencies, I like the WHO, the CDC, and UNICEF all have fantastic COVID-related resource pages that are updated on a daily basis. And then wherever you are, you should also be staying informed by your local health ministry. And I found the link for my friends in Greece, so you'll have that information. But again, it's really important to be going to these trusted medical sources rather than to WhatsApp or TikTok or things like this, because they're being responsible about sharing information that is scientifically valid. And I think that's really important. Now, whether you're a scientist or not, there's some really nice non-professional or non-medical ways to get this information. Going to reliable journalistic outlets is really, really important. So again, remember, anybody can post anything they want on the internet that doesn't make it true. And that's why journalism in this time is so important. So the New York Times, for example, has made all of their COVID-related reporting free, which is amazing, right? It's all in front of the paywall. The Economist, which I think is one of the greatest publications out there, they've been doing spectacular reporting on both the health and the financial and the political implications of COVID. And they're making a lot of that information free as well. Now, for me as a scientist, I read Nature magazine every week. That's the premier scientific journal. And their news articles are actually free and anybody can read those. So that's a great place to keep abreast of what's going on in science. There's also Science magazine, which is like Nature. And then I also read a magazine called The Scientist, which is written for life scientists by life scientists. So that's also, they've been doing fantastic COVID reporting, showing a lot of the scientific efforts around the world that aren't making the New York Times or The Economist. And then finally, there are some places that are aggregating data in a way that I think is really responsible. Both Google and Facebook have stepped up their efforts to be providing, yeah, I know, right? Both Google and Facebook have really stepped up their efforts to be providing reliable news and to be getting rid of fake news. And so both of them, Google and Facebook, each run a COVID hub that they update every day with articles from reliable sources. So, and then finally, the last place that I go often is a website called Our World in Data. And they have an enormous COVID resource page where they very carefully explain where they got the data, what are the strengths and the limitations of the data that they're showing you, and then there are lots of cool ways to visualize that data. So later on, when we talk, for example, about Greece's statistics, that's where I got those data. And you'll see on all of my slides, I've put a link to where I got the information. So I'm really trying to keep track of where I heard things. So remember, just because a family member shared something with you doesn't mean that you should share it. If you don't trust it, don't share it.
And if you don't know the source, so
Exactly.
the key takeaway from here is, try to get information from reliable and trusted source and not listen to whatever people send you, because there is a lot of.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so I mentioned the WHO. So one of the websites that I like a lot is this Mythbusters page that the WHO has been pulling up. So this is something that I recommend you all go take a look at, because as soon as these fake news things start getting out, the WHO does make an effort to hit on these various points. So, here's an example about 5G mobile networks don't spread COVID. I mean, when I think about it as a scientist, it's a silly idea. Viruses and networks, like infrastructure networks, have nothing to do with each other. A virus needs something alive. But we think a lot about 5G in terms of China. And since there's been a lot of political posturing made about this virus coming from China, then I can understand why fake news has come up suggesting 5G is there. And it's just not. Those two things have nothing to do with each other. So please do take a little while to take a look at this Mythbusters site, because it really is quite useful. So what are the things that you should actually be doing right now? And here are the main things. There are 4 major things you can be doing today in order to stay safe and to help other people. So the first thing is stay home. I know, which is exactly what we're doing. Remember, when you stay home, you are minimizing the routes that the virus can take in order to get to you, to make you sick. And you're also minimizing your potential to be making other people sick. So one of the things that's a bit unusual about this virus is that it has an extremely long incubation period. which means that you could be making other people sick for 2 weeks before you even know that you're sick, which is not how most of these illnesses work. So by staying safe, even if you don't feel sick, just in case you are and you don't know it yet, you're minimizing your chance of making other people sick. So that's really important. I know social distancing is a pain. I know it has financial implications. I know it has social implications, but don't cheat. Stay home whenever you possibly can. If you have to go out in public, try to stay 1 to 2 meters away from other people at all times. And the reason for this is the way the virus is spread is through these droplets that come out of a person when they cough or when they sneeze. And these droplets tend to travel 1 to 2 meters in the air before they hit somebody. So again, trying to stay away from other people makes it harder for the virus to hop from person to person. Wash your hands. You've heard about this one. The best weapon we have, that's right. The best weapon we have against this virus is plain old soap and water. Remember, you don't need antibacterial soap because antibiotics don't work on viruses. All you need is soap and water. And remember, everyone's talking about 20 seconds, sing your favorite song while you're washing your hands, and then rinse them all off. This is, again, the best thing we can possibly be doing. And then the fourth thing has to do with face masks. And I know there are a lot of questions about this.
There's a lot of discussion, you know, about
that's right.
Like that kind. Is the right thing to do? Is it worse? Right.
So right now, here's the current thinking. If you know that you are sick, or if you are caring for someone that you know has COVID, then you should be wearing a medical grade mask. If you are not under those situations, don't use medical grade masks because the healthcare personnel need these masks and they're in very short supply. So only try to buy or wear medical masks if you know you're sick or someone in your house is sick. However, it's been advised by many governments that we should be wearing face coverings when we're out in public, cloth face coverings. So here is my super high-tech cloth face covering that I made for myself out of a bandana and 2 rubber bands.
You can share your screen, Tiffany. Then
oh, you can't see it. That's right. Sure. Here is my bandana. It's a folded cloth, and it's got 2 rubber bands on it. And I'm not going to put it on my face because I'm wearing a lot of makeup. But when I went out yesterday to the post office, this is what I wore over my nose and mouth. And the idea here is not, this won't stop the virus from coming in, but it will stop the droplet from touching my face. And if I'm sick, it'll stop the droplets from getting out and spraying on another person. So the most important thing to remember here, though, is that these masks are not a substitute for hand washing. They are not a substitute for social distancing. They're only to be used if you absolutely must be out of your house. So those are kind of the 4 big things that you can be doing right now to protect yourself, to protect your family, and to protect your community. So, okay, so that was, I wanted to share that. Let's go back to my deck for just a minute here. Now, why are we doing all of these things? So you've probably heard the phrase flattening the curve. You've probably even seen this great cartoon.
Yeah.
And I want to point out 2 things about this, why we're doing this. The first thing is we are trying to make it so that not everyone gets sick at the same time. If you notice here, the areas under the curve aren't actually different. The same number of people are getting sick. But what matters is they're not always getting sick. They're not all getting sick at the same time. And that is so important because our healthcare systems only have a certain capacity, which is shown here in this dotted line. And if we break our healthcare systems, then we really can't fight this epidemic at all. And this is what we saw in Italy, for example, and in New York City, where their healthcare systems are in a lot of trouble. But where I live in California, our politicians, our governor, shut down businesses and put things, social distancing into place really quite rapidly. In fact, much sooner than anybody really thought was necessary. But as a result, our healthcare system in California is still working. So this is why we're going through all this.
Okay.
And there's another bit of news that I want to share with you all to try to overcome fake news. And there's a lot of fake news out there that this virus is man-made. And I just want to show you the evidence right now that this is a natural virus, right? So what's
How do
believed?
we know that, Tiffany?
Let me share some of that information with you. So one of the things that folks have done over and over and over is done what's called genome sequencing of the virus that causes COVID, which is called SARS-CoV-2. So what I'm showing you here in blue is the entire genome of this virus. That's like the biological instruction manual for this virus. And then if we look at just the spike protein, which is here in pink, the spike protein is what you see in all the pictures of the virus that makes it look like a crown. That's why it's called coronavirus, right? Corona meaning crown. So if we look here at this spike protein, what these scientists were able to do was to compare it to a bunch of other coronaviruses that are found in a lot of animals. So let's just zoom in and look at this. This is important. So you can see we're looking at the human sequence of this virus, and then we're looking at a lot of other coronaviruses that are in bats. We're looking at the previous SARS virus, and also at viruses that were found later in an animal called a pangolin. And what you can see is that these viruses are extremely similar to each other. And that suggests that they all came from a natural origin. And in fact, what people think happened is that this virus came from a bat, probably went to an intermediate host, something like a pangolin, and from there made the jump into humans. Now, this is not an unusual thing. This is called zoonosis. Zoonosis is not unusual at all. It's happened many, 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 many times in the past. And usually it happens when humans and animals are in very close proximity to each other. And that can happen because humans are destroying the natural habitat of these animals. It can be because of intensive agriculture. And it can also be when people are eating animals that are wild animals, so like bats and pangolins. So that's one way that we know that this looks like a very natural virus. Now, you can't see that from this data here, but it turns out that the way this virus works isn't the way a human would have guessed that it works. The way the virus binds to cells is actually not the way other viruses bind that we already know about. So if you were designing a virus, you wouldn't have designed it to work in a way that nobody knew this worked. Now, interestingly, after we figured out how the human SARS-CoV-2 virus worked, somebody figured out that that same mechanism actually does work in pangolins. So what we see is that nature found another way to solve the problem, and it's not the way a human would have solved the problem. So that's more evidence that this is a natural virus. And so taken together, we just need to remember that all of these conspiracy theories about this being a bioweapon doesn't seem to be the case. This is just another natural pandemic like the ones we've seen before. What's different here is not the virus. What's different is how connected people are. That's what's really important here. And I just want to share.
I would say how connected, and
Yeah.
also how that people don't know that they have it for the first 1 week or two, and how infectious it is. So what we are looking here, Tiffany?
So yeah, so here what we're looking at is a cool map where, because this type of genomic sequencing has become so fast, so cheap, and so democratized, scientists and doctors all over the world have been doing genetic sequencing on this virus to see what mutations, what changes are popping up, and also how the virus is spreading around the world. So this is an unprecedented amount of detail, which is helping us understand how the virus works, and also helping us design things like vaccines and treatments so that we know these things are still going to be working in the future. And I also want to mention that this democratization is really important. There was this beautiful article in The Scientist not too long ago.
Wait.
Sure.
So the virus mutates as it goes from country to country, or from region to region?
Or from person to person.
Or from person to person. So, okay, let's assume that we try to find a cure, or we try to find the vaccine. This mutation, does it actually create problems? So we need to find a different cure or mutation. Does it change it too much, or it doesn't really matter?
So the answer is it depends. Now with, so mutation is the way evolution works. It's a natural process. And the reason viruses evolve so much faster than, say, humans is because they just make more of themselves. And every time they copy themselves, there's the chance for there to be a mistake, which is a mutation. Now, in particular with SARS-CoV-2, what we're seeing is that this virus does not mutate particularly quickly, which is in our favor. And because we had all those genome maps that I've been showing you, scientists are able to point to the places on the genome that aren't changing, that do not change, because they're so important to the virus. And then when you're designing a vaccine, when you're designing a therapy, you target those places because they're not changing and because they're so important to the virus. And what you want to do is stop the virus from working. So SARS-CoV-2, the mutation rate at this time is not particularly worrisome to people.
So if in Greece, for example, we do the genome sequencing of CoV and how it reacts here, that will be adding to the global community in terms of
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And remember, this type of DNA sequencing has gotten incredibly cheap, much, much cheaper than it ever was before. And we even have devices where folks don't need to be in a fancy laboratory to be doing this kind of sequencing. It's more and more democratized. And again, the more information we have, the better equipped we are to save lives and to be fighting this virus.
In recent years, we have seen health experts. They write white papers. They write the epidemiologists. The scientists, they have been warning about things that would go wrong. So did anybody listen? Even Bill Gates gave a talk. So
yes.
did anybody listen?
I think the issue is that the right people weren't listening, and also the money didn't necessarily follow who was listening. So we have known for many, many years that there was another pandemic likely, probably coming again, because humans are so connected, because humans and animals are close together. This was a no-brainer that this was going to happen. And for that reason, some folks are saying, okay, you know what a black swan event is. A black swan event is something that's not predictable, but that has big consequences, right? So folks have been saying, oh, this is a black swan. But there are other thinkers who've been saying, this isn't a black swan. This is actually something that is called a gray rhino. And I'm just going to share my screen for just a second so I can share this information with you guys. Yeah. So Michelle Booker, who has been doing thought leadership around this for a really long time, says that a gray rhino is a threat that is completely obvious, but we choose to ignore it. Unlike a black swan event that you can't see coming, a gray rhino is enormous and you can see it coming from a really far way away. So I think she's got that mostly right. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Now, there are some countries that did a good job in terms of dedicating money and also doing some preparedness. So for example, in France, a few years ago, their national high-speed railroad, their train system, ran a simulation in which they practiced converting trains into hospital beds to be treating people as they were transporting. And what do you know? 2 years ago, they had to spend a lot of money on that. And now they're doing it. They're transporting patients in trains because they already knew how to do this and they already had spent the budget to do it. So I think there's some important lessons here, because it's not enough to have the knowledge. You have to have the political will, the long range planning, and also the financial discipline to make a lot of these hard choices, right? If you're a taxpayer, you're probably not excited about paying taxes for a threat that doesn't feel real to you and that might not materialize. And for a politician who's seeking re-election, it's really hard for them to convince their voters, yes, we need to be spending money on this. But now what we're seeing, that's right, but now what we're seeing is the consequences of not having that discipline and not doing the long range planning.
I see. So you mentioned before about France, about countries being prepared or acting early on, like the state of California. So seeing the Greek numbers, how do you think, from a scientific standpoint, because we Greeks like to have done everything well, so how do you think we are doing with containing this epidemic?
Yeah. So
Data
let's look.
you will see, do you have anything you can say?
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen so we can get some data. So here are some of the latest data that I want to share with you. So we can think about deaths, we can think about infection, and we can also think about testing. So here is the number of confirmed deaths due to COVID as of yesterday. So I looked these numbers up for you yesterday. And what you can see here is how these curves are starting to flatten out for COVID deaths. Now, so you can see Italy is the case where everyone is saying, you know, they have a strong crisis. So Greece is flattening out its curve much more quickly than Italy, approximately the same as South Korea. But it's important to remember that the South Korean population is 5 times larger than Greece's population. So in that sense, if we start normalizing by population, we see that in some ways, Greece is kind of in the middle of the pack for how they're doing. So, and also if we look at daily confirmed deaths, here's Greece all the way down the bottom. You've got very few confirmed deaths. Again, we're not normalizing for population number. And I'm just trying to show you the China numbers here for comparison, because China started sooner than we all did and used much more heavy-handed measures to lock things down. So you can see that Greece here is doing a nice job in having smaller numbers of COVID confirmed deaths.
And if we go 2 slides back, sorry, Tiffany, if we go 2 slides back, we see that Greece is doing same as South Korea, but if we take into account population, maybe it's higher. But then South Korea, which is a great example, is have been prepared with SARS in the past, and Greece has no experience from any epidemic. So from that standpoint, seeing the curves here, I think we are doing a pretty good job.
I think so too, and that was exactly the point I was going to make here, was if we normalize for population numbers, South Korea, even though it's 5 times larger, has fewer deaths, but they were prepared by the previous epidemic. That's exactly right. Singapore, the same, right? Singapore has a small population and they already went through SARS 10 years ago, so they were more ready. It also has to do a lot with trust in government and how well folks are doing at communicating transparently with their citizens. Now, if we compare to the rest of Europe, instead of comparing to Asia, let's look at the rest of Europe. What you can see here again is Greece is doing pretty well. You all are kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of confirmed deaths per million people. In contrast, Italy, Spain, they're really struggling right now. Now, there are things that Greece can be doing better. So for example, testing is something a lot of countries can be doing better. So yesterday there was some nice news about Iceland, and how Iceland is the example of the country that decided to basically test everyone even before anybody was getting sick. And so you can see they've had almost 10% of their population been tested as of April 4th, which is a huge number. Now here's Greece down here. Only 3.4 of 1,000 people have been tested so far. That's less than the United States. That's less than in Italy, and but it's more than in places like India, about the same as the UK. So this is something that I think I would love to see Greece do more of. You have a small population. You have the opportunity here to grab a lot of really meaningful data. And as we're going to talk about in a little while, testing is really super important. And so this is something I think Greece could get ahead of. So your prime minister said just 2 days ago that you're winning a few battles, but the war here is not over. And this is something that we're going to come back to over and over. This fight against COVID-19 is a marathon, not a sprint. So we have to have in our minds that this type of efforts need to go on for quite some time. This isn't going to be a one and done. This is not going to be over by summer.
So it's going to take a while, and then you have prepared a couple of scenarios to see how scenarios will play. So before we move and see the scenarios, and I see here in the chat that we have a lot of interesting questions. So let's move to the scenarios. But before we get there, one question. If we go back 5 years when Bill Gates gave the famous talk, Warning on Epidemics,
Right.
and somewhere, and you were like the global president, the global prime minister, what action would you would have taken? How as an scientist would have done things differently than politicians?
Yeah. So the first thing I would have done was I would have torn down barriers to data transparency and data sharing. I would have explicitly and continuously showcased the importance of science and scientific thinking to everyday life. And most importantly, if I was a leader, I would have put my budgets where my mouth is. It's really easy for people to say science is important and then turn around and cut science and education budgets. And I would not have done that. I would have been giving even more money. So for example, the WHO operates on less than 5 billion US dollars per year. That's insane. The Gates Foundation gave out $3 billion in 2015 alone. So we can see that there's a lot of under-resourcing going on here. I would have also been forming relationships with reputable news outlets to make sure that people were able to get reputable information for free as quickly as possible. And I would have also been commissioning independent analyses and simulations to try to figure out many, many scenarios of what we could be doing to plan for these disasters and to work out which responses are most appropriate under which conditions so that everyone has the information they need. And it's not just the federal government that needs to be running responses, but that local governments are also empowered to be doing what needs to be done, when it needs to be done in the most evidence-based and appropriate way. So Tiffany Vora for president, that's what I would have done. But again, it comes down to money and will, right? And that's where long-range thinking is really difficult.
And instead of spending billions and billions and multiple billions for weapons, you know, we need to put controls on epidemics and health check. So
Yes.
Recently, New York Times mentioned that although political leaders have locked their broad borders, scientists, they are tearing down theirs, as you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? Is the scientific community getting together? Do we see this happening or not?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that gives me the most hope and the most optimism. So here is the article that Niki is talking about, where it's amazing what's happening, where scientists, frankly, all the crap that we do all the time about trying to keep secrets so nobody steals your paper idea, all this stuff, it's just going away. And people are sharing information in ways that are remarkable. In fact, so here's an example of that. So there's GitHub, which is a repository for open source code and open source data. And if you go onto GitHub and you take a look at what they're working on for projects that are happening for COVID, you can see something really remarkable. So there are nearly 35,000 free open source projects going on right now around the world at COVID, to tackle COVID. And anyone can go and work on these. What was that?
What are these projects about?
So they can be all kinds of things. So they can be volunteer computing for large scale research. They can be ways to visualize data so that it's more easy to understand. It's collaborative tracking of the epidemic. And it's also sharing plans for DIY protection in medical devices. So plans for 3D printing ventilators or 3D printing face shields, they're here on GitHub and anybody can download them. It's amazing.
This is amazing.
I know. And there are lots and lots of these examples. We're seeing there are online communities where scientists can volunteer their time to do data analyses. MIT just started its COVID-19 challenge, which you can go in now and work on these projects. If you've got a solution you're working on, you can try to get funding for it. And even XPRIZE has started a data-powered COVID-19 alliance to share data, to share funding, and to share resources. And in fact, Niki, while I was preparing these stories, for our audience for today, I actually had to stop what I was doing because I started crying because I was so overwhelmed by how positive and generous and giving and collaborative people are being. This is completely different from how the world was 6 months ago. And if I have to point to one thing good coming out of this, it's this. It's humanity coming together. Yeah.
Humanity coming together. So before we move to the Q&A, this is the part I like the most. Let's discuss about the next day. What is going to happen in the next 6, 12 months? I mean, what are the scenarios? Here right now, we are in insecurity, in uncertainty. People are asking, and I see the Q&A, what about the antiviral? What about the vaccine? What about the cure? If this is a very unsafe territory and we want to cross the river, to go to the other side, what are the building blocks to build a safe bridge to get to the next day in safety?
You got it. So let's, what I want to do now is share with you all my thinking about how I think through this. What are the building blocks and how are they coming together? So let me show you, and you are the first people to see this, so it's kind of exciting. So the first thing I think about is what are our goals around COVID-19? So here they are. We need to be able to identify people who are at risk and to understand how at risk an individual is. We need to identify people who actively have the virus. We need to treat people who are sick. We need to be saving lives in healthcare systems, preventing future infections, and balancing health and the economy. Along the way, we want to be figuring out how this virus works, and we want to be laying the foundation to be ready for the next pandemic. So these are the big categories for our goals. And how are we meeting these goals? So these are categories on the right I'm showing you of strategies to meet these goals. So immunity testing is a set of strategies to identify people who are at risk. Same with testing for the virus itself. Yes, Niki.
So immunity testing is I test if I have the antibodies. For example, if I have been sick, knowing it or not knowing, and I have the antibody.
That's exactly correct.
Will they last? Do I know that they last? Am I protected for 6 months, 1 year? We don't know.
Right now, the scientific assumption based on how other diseases work is that antibodies, if you've already been sick and you've recovered, then you might be immune for as long as 2 years. Okay. Now, the good news about that 2 years number is by then we should have a vaccine. More on that in a minute. But the short answer, honestly, is that we don't actually know. And there's some preliminary data coming in now where folks are trying to look to see how long immunity it actually lasts. So virus testing is testing if you're sick right now. Immunity testing is testing whether you were sick in the past with this particular virus. Okay, there's a whole bunch of treatments for treating people who are currently sick. That's what you all are asking about. That's antivirals, that's antivirals, antibodies, plasma, even vaccines can count under treatments. So that's the pharma industry, what they're working on. Saving lives in healthcare systems, we need to know where cases are, who's sick, and how many people are sick, and how does that map to our healthcare system capacity. Preventing future infections kind of takes 2 prongs. One is through this vaccine strategy, and another is by the things that we do, like contact tracing, which is being able to know every single person that a sick person came in contact with so that those people can put themselves into quarantine. It's also a data sharing issue and some other issues I'll show you. And then balancing health and the economy at the most fundamental level is when our governments tell us to do things, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to balance loss of life with loss of GDP. So that's how we're going to be meeting those goals.
That's a hard call, yeah. And tracking cases, I see that also WeChat, because yesterday we were connected with an alum, a PNG alum from China, and they have all these high-tech in WeChat app that you get a QR code, which is green, orange, or red. That means if you are green, you are free of virus. If you are, if for example, your neighbor gets the virus, then you become automatically orange or red, depending on how they calculate. And also Google and Apple, they are working on developing an application on tracking cases.
That's right. These are things we're calling immunity passports, which is a way of sharing essentially how at risk you are of getting sick or of making somebody else sick. So absolutely. Okay, so now everyone wants to know about timelines.
Yes,
so
yes.
that's where we're going. Now, before I show you those, I just want to remind everyone that we're also thinking about how optimistic are we? So I actually worked up 3 scenarios based on being highly optimistic, reasonably optimistic, and not so optimistic. And that's what we're going to look at today. And I just want to remind you that any model I show you today, in fact, any model you see anywhere, by definition, is going to be wrong. We always have details wrong. But what's important isn't whether a model is right or wrong, but if it's useful in helping us prepare our resources and our mindsets. And so what we're going to do today is look at these as things that are actually useful. Okay, so this is the one that I think is, based on my intuition, the most reasonable. And I'm calling this moderate optimism. So if you look here, you can see that this is a timeline that goes from 2020 through October 2021. So we're talking about more than a year here. So again, remember, marathon, not sprint. Very, very important. So what a lot of us are anticipating is that there's going to be a second major wave of COVID cases, probably over what's our summer in the Northern Hemisphere, when governments start trying to lift restrictions in order to get people back to work.
So we don't have any evidence that during the summer, because of temperature, because of the summertime, the virus will go away and we can go swimming in the Greek islands. No.
No, unfortunately, there's no evidence for that. And also remembering that because people travel and are connected, if someone gets sick someplace hot and then goes someplace cold, they're taking the virus with them. So I would not count on any type of temperature effects helping us out. We're likely to see these outbreaks going on all year. And what you can see here is there's a period where we're going to be focusing on emergency treatments, which are treatments that have not been approved through the gold standard of clinical trial, but folks are either trying to gather evidence as quickly as possible, or also the governments are giving exceptions for what's called compassionate use, where you can just try something because somebody's dying. And so I'm expecting to see the transition to fully approved drugs starting to happen in around September, because remember, a drug has to be tested to know that it's safe and that it actually works. And that just takes time and it takes data. Now, the exception to that is a treatment which is called plasma treatment, which is when you take the blood from someone who's already recovered from being sick, you spin it to get the antibodies out, and then you put the antibodies into someone who is sick right now, and it helps them fight. And those plasma treatments, actually the clinical trial in the UK was supposed to start this week, but it got delayed. But people in New York are running trials on this right now. So I am hopeful that we could have plasma treatments approved within a matter of weeks, which will be hugely helpful while we're waiting for drugs to be repurposed or to be invented and tested.
Are there any drugs in clinical tests?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are many drugs in clinical tests right now. So I have a slide that I skipped, but there are more than 70 drugs right now that I know about that are being tested: antibodies, antivirals, cell-based drugs, RNA-based drugs, repurposed drugs, and other drugs. And the vast majority of those are in preclinical trials. But for example, there are 13 antibody treatments right now that are in clinical trials, and 2 other ones that are under compassionate and expanded use. So we are seeing phase 1 and phase 2 trials happening in summer this year, and phase 2 and 3 happening, some of them are even going on in March and April. Chinese companies are ahead of this, right? Because they had their first wave sooner. So Chinese companies that are working on things like vaccines or treatments are a bit faster.
So what does a clinical trial 3 means? Means that it will get in the market soon, in months, in years, in weeks?
Well, so I think we'll start seeing at the back half of 2020 approval of drugs. But what I think is going to happen is because governments need to be seen to move fast, I think there'll be provisional approval where they'll still have to keep getting more data based on more and more people using the drug, and that data being assessed in an ongoing fashion about whether this stuff is actually safe and whether it works.
Yeah. So release it and further validate it as it goes. Okay.
Exactly. So then in terms of testing for the virus itself has been happening, what I'm calling POC here, that stands for point of care. That's a hospital or a clinic. So I think that it's likely that most virus testing will remain at the point of care through at least July. But we know there's a big push to get at-home testing for active viral infections. Because again, if you think you're sick, the worst possible thing you can do is rush to the hospital. Because if you are sick, you can be making other people sick. And if you're not sick, you can be getting sick from the people who are in the hospital. So at-home testing is going to be really important. But again, your at-home testing has to be really, really reliable. And we're not there yet.
Okay, what about the home testing, the at-home testing that they are selling at the internet right now?
Don't buy it. In fact, that is so important. I'm going to stop my screen so I can look everybody in the eyes. Do not buy tests online yet. They are not ready. They are not reliable. Wait until you see that major health authorities have approved at-home testing.
So FDA is going to approve one?
Yes. I mean, we'll have to see how soon. That's because they have to do a lot of testing of the tests to make sure that they are giving you the true positives, knowing who is actually sick or is actually immune, while minimizing the false positive and the false negative.
Yeah.
So frankly, the gold standard is pregnancy tests. Pregnancy tests are at-home tests that have hugely high specificity and sensitivity is the technical terms. And so that's what folks are hoping for, and we're not there yet. Okay.
Let's go back to the screen.
Let's go back to the screen. So here, so I think what we're going to be seeing for immunity testing and contact tracing and your immunity passport is that governments are going to start putting together things like those QR codes within a couple of months. You mentioned that Google and Apple in the United States are already working on that. So I think this is reasonable. But here's something that no one's going to want to hear, but I need to show you. I doubt that we are going to see a vaccine available to anyone before the end of 2021. The timeline that I'm showing you right here is an 18-month development cycle for a vaccine. That's for designing it, manufacturing it, testing it, making sure it's safe, and manufacturing enough of it that you can distribute it. The 18-month cycle is the cycle length for seasonal flu, and that's what I've based this on here. So the vaccine is not the knockout punch. No, that's backwards. The vaccine is the knockout punch. The vaccine is not our first line of defense. Okay. So get it in your minds right now that we're going to be waiting for the vaccine, which means all these other things are going to be so, so, so important. And so what we think is going to happen is, so here we are right now in the current lockdown. We think governments are going to lift that lockdown, trying to reboot the economy, but that's going to cause a second wave of infections, which will lead to another lockdown. And then as all of these other things, testing, treatments, prevention start to come online, we're going to see another lifting of the restrictions. And then I'm guessing probably in early 2021, now we're going to start to see small outbreaks happening all the time, kind of as a background level. But then those will fade out over time as vaccine, immunity testing, virus testing starts becoming much greater. But I also think that governments are going to be asking everyone who can work from home to do so, for all of us to be traveling less, to be having small gatherings, meaning maybe you can eat in your local restaurant, but you can't go to a rock concert anytime soon, and to go on being alert.
Yeah, so let me summarize to make sure I understand this slide. So you see a vaccine coming as of July, August 21?
Yeah, September, October even. Late 2021.
Late 2021, the second half, let's say.
Yep.
And before that, from this summer onwards, we need to kind of develop a strategy and lines of defense by testing, by antiviral testing, by treatment, whatever it is. So, and be careful and social distancing so we do not go back to the steep curve and kind of flood our hospitals, and make sure that we manage the way we do business and we open up the country or the world being safe, but not in a lockdown all the time, so economy suffers tremendously. Do I read that correct?
You read it exactly correctly. Yeah. And in fact, if you're willing, we can take a look at my take-home messages here. So,
is there a more optimistic scenario, Tiffany?
yes, there is. Hold on a second. Let me get you to that optimistic. There is an optimistic scenario which can help happen for various reasons. Yep. Let me show that to you guys. So share screen. Okay, so here is a more optimistic scenario where what we can see here is that, again, we'll see a second wave, but we'll transition more quickly to these smaller outbreaks because we're going to be seeing approval of treatments faster, largely due to repurposing of drugs and really clever clinical trials. This is possible. And you can see here, I even put the plasma approval happening within a week or two. That would be highly optimistic, but is not impossible. Similarly, we could see the shifts from point of care testing to at-home testing happening as early as June, if these tests can get tested themselves and approved and also be placed at price points and be distributed in ways that people can actually get them. We could be moving into this immunity passport and contact tracing paradigm sooner if, like Google and Apple, are working well with governments, and if people actually trust Google and Apple with their health data. That's a whole other issue. And there are 2 vaccines that are in clinical trials right now. One was originally done for Ebola, and another one was originally done for a different virus that people are trying to see if they work in for COVID-19, even though that's not the disease they were designed for. And if the answer to that is yes, we can repurpose these vaccines, then we could be seeing a vaccine available much sooner than I was projecting, perhaps even at the beginning of 2021. But to be frank, that would be the fastest vaccines ever, right? So that's why I'm not so sure that's going to happen. But in the most optimistic scenario, we might only have to face one more lockdown. And then after that, by fall, be having these lighter restrictions where we're being asked to work from home, to have less travel, and to have small gatherings. But we've got all the tools in place to be sending people back to work. And that's what governments really want.
So do you see any scenario with no second wave?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. No one ever likes talking to me. No, I don't, because I think what's happening right now is I'm concerned that restrictions are going to be lifted a little too soon, just because people are so fatigued and the economy is hurting so badly. So I'm guessing we're going to see some restrictions lifted in May, and then by the end of May, it's going to be clear that it was too soon. And then the restrictions will have to, because a second wave will come. So I think everyone should expect a second wave.
Yeah, I had some more questions to ask you, but I think you should jump into asking a few questions from our friends attending. I was about to ask you if this crisis is going to bring a biotech industry, and how countries like Greece can develop biotech prevention industry. I guess the answer is yes. So,
yes.
So let's move and try to answer a few questions here. You can see the Q&A also. If you think, I will start with questions from Mr. Edward Tazia, who is asking if it's likely that the original source of the virus are the wet markets of China, and if so, if it is the same source of the earlier viruses. And I guess the question also is, if that is the case, are we asked as a global community for the wet markets to close once and forever, if it's being again and again a source of virus that makes our life upside down?
Right. So the current hypothesis is yes, it came from some kind of food transmission because people were eating these wild animals. Now, there are many countries in the world that have already officially forbidden, bushmeat or these kind of things. For example, it's thought that HIV might have jumped into humans from apes, from people eating monkey meat, ape meat, essentially. So it's not a question of whether we already know this is a problem. It's a question of people being willing to enforce it. Will they actually go and shut those down? Because this type of game hunting helps, it's a livelihood, right? Some people make their money by sourcing bushmeat, and that's how they support their families. So governments haven't been really excited about shutting that down because they'll be putting people out of work. But yes, it's entirely possible that this will finally be the straw that breaks the camel's back, where we say, no, we can't do this anymore. It's also an interesting argument for cellular agriculture. If you're always growing meat in the laboratory, then you would be controlling these viruses by definition, rather than taking things from living animals. So there is kind of a sci-fi perspective to be taken as well here about a transition to different types of food sourcing.
Yeah, and cellular meat is also taking care of environmental concerns and all this CO2 emission. We have several ways of asking the same question, which is, and we touched this on your scenarios, but we see a lot of people being concerned that governments, they are opening up the countries, they're opening up the market, they open up the economy. So they are concerned, is it the right thing? For example, Dimitris Xenotroulias is asking, are they doing the right thing, or should we kind of relapse?
So I think that I'm an experimentalist. So I've been looking at this from an experimentalist mindset, where we've got hundreds of governments around the world who are all doing different things. And if we're honest and transparent about sharing our data, what we're doing is effectively running an innovation sprint. Now, granted, with people's lives at stake, but we're going to be able to see if governments are really good about sharing their data and sharing statistics, then we're going to be getting more and more information about what works and what doesn't work. So I don't think anybody is, what I think is going to happen is governments are going to reasonably try to help their citizens by lifting restrictions, and then it's going to be clear that it's not working, and they're going to be pushing them back down at different rates and at different levels of severity. So somewhere in there is the sweet spot, and if we have enough data, we'll be able to find it.
There is a question also from our attendees, and it was a question I wanted to ask you also. Yesterday, it was breaking news that USA has removed supporting of the World Health Organization.
Great, awesome. So I don't really like to talk about politics because American politics right now are a bit toxic.
Not supporting World Health Organization. And if supporting World Health Organization is important, and what does it mean? Because we know it's underfunded already.
Yes, I think this would be catastrophic. If governments pull their support from the World Health Organization right now, that would just be undermining all of our efforts to have a global response to make sure this actually works and to save lives and economies. The WHO is important because it's an international organization that works across politics, across governments, across companies. They are really the linchpin for surveillance, for monitoring, and for helping folks with their preparedness. If you undercut that, we have nothing left.
Totally understood. We have a lot of people asking the scenarios you presented about what is going to happen in May, June, July. Is it a global scenario? Is it a scenario that goes, for example, for Greece? Because Greece, we know we are in lockdown till hopefully the end of April, beginning of May, and then slowly we will start reopening. So yeah. Two questions here, and I will combine the questions we get from attendees, and we have been flooded with questions, and maybe we can send them your way, and the ones we have not been able to answer, maybe you can answer them and we send them to our community.
Of course.
So the question is, does it apply for Greece? and how in Greece, how it is, the scenario you presented apply for Greece, is it a global one, and how Greece can go about rigorous testing. For example, if we wanted to test everybody in Greece, either for the virus or for the antibodies, how we should go about? What do you think?
So regarding what I was actually modeling there, I focused my models on Europe and North America. So, so yes, Greece. The reason I did that is because China's trajectory started sooner, but they didn't share a lot of their data. So it's harder for me to get evidence on the Chinese case. And I was disregarding Latin America, Africa, India, places that are very early in their trajectory, again, because we don't have enough data to know what's going on there. So I treated Europe and North America as in that sweet spot where it's been going on just long enough that we have a lot of information to work with. So that's it. So yes, I built these for you all. So it does. This is what I think is going to happen in our areas. So Greece, testing. Yes. So regarding testing, one of the big issues right now is that whole point of care versus at home thing. If there were a way for folks to reasonably literally go door to door and do the testing, I would love to see Greece completely flood their population with tests right now. Now, we have to get enough tests. So like physical boxes, we have to manufacture enough of those. That's being ramped up. So I don't see this happening this week or next week. I don't even see it happening this month. But what if, say, by June, there was some version of a test kit that every person in Greece had access to? And that would tell us both, it would tell us a lot of things. It would tell us how immunity is progressing in the Greek community, which is important if you want to know whether people can safely go back to work. It's really important. But the testing for the virus is also important because whenever we give these statistics, remember, all our statistics are wrong by definition. Because the confirmed COVID cases are only ones where people are sick enough to go to hospital. Yeah. But we already know that a lot of people get sick and never actually show symptoms. That's what the immunity testing will actually tell us. Whereas if you had an at-home test that, say, everybody was taking every week, you would have tons more data about who's actually sick, how sick are they, and have they cleared it. Right now, we're kind of fumbling around in the dark.
So the key is to have a home testing or an easy test like pregnancy test that you can take it every week, and then it has to be easily accessible and very cheap or free.
That's right. And it has to be easy for you to share the data back to the government, and you have to know that your data are protected, right? Exactly. One of the things when we share our survey that I would love you all to help me with is stigmatization, right? So Niki and I had a conversation last week where she said, oh, are you worried that people who've already had COVID are going to be stigmatized? And I said, as a biologist, no, I would be more worried about people who haven't been sick yet being stigmatized, because those are the people who could be making other people sick. That's what I would be worried about. So I have some questions for you guys around that, about how you feel, because again, if you're holding up a QR code that has a color on it, you're putting a label on yourself. So do you trust your government with that label? And do you trust your community with that label to treat everyone fairly and whatever it is, whatever fair means, reasonably? It's an important question. What kind of society do we want to live in? Because even once this is over, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of businesses do we want to work for? What kind of country do I want to live in? What kind of community do I want to live in? And the decisions that we make now are going to matter for a long time.
Yeah, and how I trust my government. Tiffany, thank you so much. Can you please share in your screen the link for your survey, for your research work?
You bet. Here it comes.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. We took 10 minutes more than the hour we promised, but that was so interesting, the discussion and the questions. So we will see you all in our next event, which is happening next Monday with the president of SRI, talking about healthcare around the globe and ventures around the globe, and what is happening in this area. Tiffany, thank you for your amazing presentation and for your time to be with our community here.
Okay, stay healthy, everyone, and just remember, this is going to be a long thing, but we're all in it together. So remember that. That's what I remember.
Thank you so much, Tiffany.